Hi, everyone. As you know, I'm Lake Shupek, I'm the North Carolina State Director for All in the Line, and we're here for our 12 o'clock panel, the past, present, and future of redistricting in North Carolina. Oh, okay. Sorry, Dr. Mattingly, I forgot you have a panelist link. So if you want to watch, Genevieve, do you think you could add him to the attendees? Hey, Bob, you got on here. That's great. We're here today with some friends from our partner organizations to talk about redistricting reform. So I'm going to do some really brief introductions of everyone, and then we'll sort of head into our questions. All right, so we are here today with Ayelet Colston, who is the chair of political action for the Raleigh Apex NAACP, and who has been sort of a face in redistricting issues here in North Carolina for a while. So I think if you volunteered for redistricting stuff, you probably know her. We also have Tomas Lopez, the executive director of Democracy NC, another organization that has been really active on this issue. And then, of course, we have Bob Phillips, who's the executive director of Common Cause North Carolina, sort of the original, doing redistricting before it was cool organization. So thank you all so much for being here. We're really glad to have you. You're all such good partners to us, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So I think I'm going to go to you, Bob, first, because like I said, you were doing redistricting before it was cool. Just to ask a little bit about, to start us off with some context about what the conversation about redistricting was like before it became a big issue after 2010. I think you are muted.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Well, you referenced about me being around and doing it when it was not cool. Maybe that's a function of my age and I'm having problems with technology. But thank you for putting this together. Like you look very calm, cool, and collected considering everything you've had to do, I guess, to put all this together. So thank you for this, and thank you for what you all do as well as being part of the effort to have fair maps in North Carolina. Great to be with Ayelet and Tomas as well. And what I'll say is, maybe I'll start out. I am a product of a school in Chapel Hill, and Tomas is from another school in Durham. So, Tomas, I'm going to hopefully impress you. I'm going to actually start out with a quote from William Faulkner to just kind of make you feel like I'm maybe a little more urbane and sophisticated than I am. But one of Faulkner's most favorite and famous quotes is, "The past is never dead. In fact, it's not even the past." And in a lot of ways, I think that speaks to our saga here in North Carolina with redistricting. Indeed, in February of 2001, I started my job with Common Cause. And then a month later, I was standing at a news conference with State Senator Ham Horton as he was introducing Senate Bill 283. And that was a redistricting reform bill. This is again 2001, when the Republicans were the minority party in North Carolina. And you had a couple of interesting other co-sponsors of that bill. One of them was at the press conference, Virginia Foxx, who is now a congresswoman in North Carolina. She was a state senator. She was a sponsor of that legislation. And another person who many of us know of and would recognize the name is Phil Berger, now the current Senate President Pro Tem. He was also a co-sponsor of that legislation. There was companion legislation in the House. It was House Bill 318, and I'll throw a name out too. The sponsor of that legislation was a guy named Art Pope. So again, looking back 20 years, a month into when I started Common Cause, and I always love when people say, "Hey, where were you, Common Cause? What were you doing when the Republicans were trying to get this and the Democrats were in charge?" Well, to your point, like we were really there. I mean, we were trying to push for redistricting reform. Indeed, the Republicans were the champions. As best I can tell, the first redistricting reform that I know about, first redistricting reform bill, was actually filed in April of 1989. And the sponsor, again, was someone that maybe many of us know. I certainly I worked with him, and that was Wake County's Skip Stam, who retired recently. But he was one of the early champions of redistricting reform. But to answer your question, back in those days, we would talk about the need to do something different, that we did not have fair maps in North Carolina. And it was just the Republicans who were for it. During the course of the 20 years between 1990 and 2010, you did in later years have one Democratic state senator actually put their name on a bill, and that was Ellie Kinnaird. Many of you all would remember, longtime Chapel Hill state senator. The one thing I will say, and then I'll stop talking in terms of getting back to that quote about the past is never dead, it's not even the past. It was always the same thing. What we had back in 2001 to 2021, and that is bills that are filed, championed by the minority party, and they don't go anywhere. There's one exception, and that's 2011, and we can talk about that later on perhaps, but the bills get filed into a committee, redistricting committee, elections committee, judicial committee, and that's where they stay. That's what happened back in February of 2001 when I first started. And of course, it's what happened in the last biennium with all the bills as well. So like, I don't even know if I answered my question or the question you gave me, but I do hope that Tomas was impressed with my quote of William Faulkner. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. And yeah, no, I think that that's kind of the perspective we wanted. You know, clearly you all were there when Democrats were in the majority, and they were the ones who were rejecting redistricting reform. So I think that the next question I have is a little bit more general, and maybe Ayelet, I'll start with you. What are some of the big problems we have in our current redistricting system that, you know, why we need reform in the first place?
I think we can see the results of the past few years sort of speak for themselves. North Carolina at one point had, of all of the major redistricting cases in the entire country, over half were out of North Carolina. So I think, you know, the past 10 years tells us that the result, you just look at the results, if nothing else, just, you know, people can see that. But as far as what are the things that need to be changed so we don't keep having that, in North Carolina, the law, there's a reason that we have so much litigation in North Carolina around redistricting. And part of that is because the laws in North Carolina, the North Carolina General Assembly, the state legislature, draws the voting maps, and they draw the congressional voting maps, but they also draw their own. So the state house and the state senate get to draw their own districts, and there's not a lot of limitations on what they're allowed to do. There are, of course, some limitations, federal, the Constitution, in the United States Constitution, and there are some limitations. There were some limitations. There's still at least a little bit of limitations in what's left of the Voting Rights Act. But so we don't have, they can get pretty close to doing what they want. And what they've learned is, even if they do it badly in a way that's discriminatory or that benefits themselves, litigation takes so long that they can still get them through the next cycle before they're really held accountable for the most part. I mean, we saw a little more speed in this, last year. And the other thing is that the governor, who is elected from the entire state, the governor cannot veto. So there's no one involved in the process who doesn't have sort of a self-interest in how they draw those voting maps. So it's sort of like, I have two kids, and sometimes we do something, if, like, let's say there's one cookie left, and you say, one kid is going to divide it in half, and then the other kid gets to choose, and then whoever divides it is really, really careful. And so what we have in North Carolina is a system more like if you just said, all right, kid, break off the size piece you want. And not to judge any of you or your children, but human nature being what it is, people will tend to want to break off a big part of the cookie for themselves. So because of that, we just have the self-interested parties drawing the maps. It is how we get here. And one other point that's going to sound really boring, but it is very important, and that is process. We don't have the mechanisms to have a lot of transparency in the process in North Carolina. What we saw in 2011 was 2 men, or actually it was a total of 3 men, went back into a private room, closed the door, and just drew the maps almost however they wanted. It was, Thomas Hoffler, Bob Russo, and David Lewis, just in private. And in North Carolina's open meeting laws, we don't have great ways to hold the General Assembly accountable for that lack of transparency. So a lot of times when I talk about redistricting reform, I'll talk about process issues, which I think a lot of people want to just kind of like, it just sounds really boring, but that's really important because that's part of how we, the people of North Carolina, know what's going on and then are able to hold our electeds accountable for what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tomas, I don't know if you want to add to that. I think that, your organization tends to really advocate hard to get people involved in the redistricting process. And I know that sort of, especially public input was one of the places where we saw a lot of deficiency, especially during the 2019 redraw. I was wondering if you wanted to add, some places that you see issues in the current process, especially for people participating in it.
Sure. Thank you, Lika, for having me. Thank you, Ayla. Thank you, Bob, for the shout out and the Faulkner quote. To the best analogy I could come up with, being in North Carolina is to underscore what Ayla was saying about the impact of not being able to have quick litigation solutions, which is that the General Assembly majority has been able to run a 4 corners offense for the basketball fans out there to run out the clock on being able to be held accountable for the ways in which they've distorted representation. One of the underlying costs of the warped redistricting that we've had is that we spend all this time, right? Conferences like these, time in our workplaces, people sort of reading, doing all this work, talking about redistricting, and not all the things that people are really tangibly affected by every day, right? Their environment, healthcare, education, all of those issues. And look, with good reason, right? We are doing this here now because of what this unlocks. But it's hard not to step back, especially at the beginning of a new decade, and say, wow, look at the time and money that was spent on redistricting, and what are all those resources could have gone but for the really harmful gerrymanders that we had, in succession over the course of many years. One thing I would point out, right, is that we talk about redistricting reform here often in the context of post 2010 and what we've seen since 2010. And I want to highlight what Bob said as that these have been conversations going on in North Carolina for a long time, but also that they've been going on in other places for a long time, and that other places have done things about redistricting even before 2010. So I think many of the people who are attending, are probably have a fairly deep background in this stuff at this point and are familiar with the fact that what makes 2010 and that cycle stand out is the way in which there was a really coordinated effort on the part of Republican legislatures across the country to implement a coordinated plan, as to redistricting. Something at that scale had not been attempted or achieved previously, right? Now, where we sit though is that in 2008, prior to 2010, right, we had California with independent redistricting. We had Arizona with independent redistricting. A whole number of Western states in particular didn't need to see what happened that year to act. And so I also want to make sure that we are, when we're talking about, right, the past, present, and future of redistricting, that we don't look at reform as purely a modern invention, as purely a, 2010s, 2020, thing that we've done. In fact, the longer that this goes on, the more that what we look at as reform is fairly time tested.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you, Tomas, for that. And I think that leads really well into the next question that I have is just, what are some reform innovations that we have seen in other states that could be maybe a good fit for North Carolina? And Bob, if you're there, I'd like to go to you because I know Common Cause obviously is a national organization that has a lot of other state affiliates and places that you all have worked on this stuff. And I know you spend a lot of time thinking about the reforms in other places. So what are some examples of reforms that you'd like to see in North Carolina that we've already seen in other states?
Well, I'd say that, I always try to simplify. This is such a complicated topic, and talking about it with people, as I've tried over 20 years, maybe with mild success, it's just always trying to make sure we don't lose people. Two big things, and the innovations, or what I think is needed, obviously, is one, the solid criteria, and that includes things that are in the North Carolina law. But a big one is where you're not looking at past elections, and you're not also considering party affiliation. But a big thing is, again, past election results, because that's the big ingredient that the gerrymanderers use. They look at how precincts perform, and then they cobble all that together. So that's one piece. And if you look at redistricting reform, as Tomas mentioned, where it's done in other states, and even if you look at that first bill that Skip Stam filed way back in 1989, it had that. It would be where you couldn't look at past election results and consider partisan data to draw the maps. I think that's one of the big crucial ones. The other one is there's got to be something independent aside from lawmakers drawing their own districts. That's critical. That's why we have, after Common Cause v. Lewis, at least in law right now, until it potentially gets rechallenged, the law that says you can't look at partisan data, you can't utilize that to draw the maps. But how do we enforce it when lawmakers get to do the deed? We even saw that in the remedial map drawing in October of 2019. Like you were down there, we talked a lot watching it, and the folks would come in and out of the committee room where there was a little bit of transparency, but we knew they were coming. They were going out of that committee room and going behind a closed door, getting the data that they needed, getting the instructions that they needed, and then coming back and changing the lines. How do you enforce that? How do you stop that? You have to have something independent of lawmakers drawing their own districts. I'll just make one other reference. It's not exactly to the question, but the interesting thing, and this again speaks to the fact that there are no clean hands in this saga of redistricting in North Carolina. We don't allow the governor to veto redistricting in North Carolina, and many states do, but we don't, because the Democrats actually made that deal. They made it back in 1996 when, for the first time, we were trying to get just veto power for the governor, and it took 3/4 of each chamber to get it on the ballot. And Republicans wanted it. They wanted the veto. They had been out of power and not holding the governor's mansion by and large, but they thought it would be something that would weaken a little bit the legislature or balance things out. And the Democrats, who controlled the legislature in 96, didn't want it. But the agreement was that the Democrats would go with approving a veto if it excluded local bills and redistricting. So it's, again, just one of those kind of funny things, but it's good to remember this. People that we work with now who are champions, it was their party that put North Carolina in this situation where the governor can't veto any kind of redistricting legislation. Anyway, sorry again, I probably went on and on.
No, I think that that's really good. That's really good context. I know I had kind of heard that that was how that came about, but it's good to get that actual fuller story. And also, I think that going back to the point that you were making about, not only do you have to have good criteria that, try to enforce nonpartisan redistricting, but you have to have an independent process, because those legislators aren't going to be able to help themselves. I think that was something that was said in some previous sessions today, is that legislators aren't going to be able to stop themselves from trying to draw things to their own advantage. And also, even without all the backroom kind of stuff that we saw during that process, I'm sure they were going to have backroom to get a more precise idea of what to do, but a lot of them really already have in their heads where their voters are, where they aren't, what the different precincts are like. So involving them at all seems to be sort of where the root of a lot of the problems are. So I don't know if maybe Ayelet, you want to talk a little bit about, so Bob kind of mentioned criteria and sort of said something about sort of having redistricting be independent. What are some models we've seen of independent redistricting? I know commissions are sort of the thing that people's talked about. What do some of those look like?
Well, there's different types of commissions, and very, very generally, I'll say people ask me a lot, what one model should we pick for redistricting reform in North Carolina? And as a lifelong North Carolinian, and I would say that taking what another state has done and just taking it whole cloth and kind of jamming it down on North Carolina, which, we have our own unique history, our own unique demographics and geography, will not in my view, is not the best way to go. However, to find a silver lining in the situation in which we find ourselves still needing reform in North Carolina is that we can look at other states and that have done reform and see what has worked well, what things could be improved upon, and maybe take some of the different concepts and use those to sort of craft what will work best for North Carolina that everyone feels comfortable with. And when it comes to, so people talk a lot about having an independent commission draw the maps, or an independent commission involved in redistricting, and that can mean different things. So first off, what do we mean by an independent commission? Could that be people who are hired by the leaders of the General Assembly, and they're technically not legislators, they're there, that's who the independent commission is? Are we talking about sort of a citizens commission? And that's been done different ways. Different states have worked to find ways and have found that lots of people do come and volunteer, citizens, to be on an independent commission. So first off, you look at who's on this independent commission. Is it really independent? And then you look at what is the role of the commission in the redistricting process, because there are some models where they'll say this is an independent commission, but when you look at it, the independent commission doesn't have that much power. They can propose a map, but then it's up to the legislature to either accept it or not accept it or change it. And so it's, it might look like it would be a solution, but when you get into it, it's very easy to be manipulated. So when you talk about an independent commission, you want to look at how do they come up with the commission, and then also what role does the commission actually have in the process, and then what power, can that commission actually approve the maps? Can they just only recommend it? And you look at it from there. In North Carolina, a lot of, whatever we come up with, we're going to have to get through the state legislature. So I hate to bring up California, because a lot of people in North Carolina are immediately going to say, nothing they do in California is going to be something we like. But I think that there have been, if nothing else, I think that we can see that there are a lot of people who are willing to participate, and regular citizens, and be on an independent commission. So I think that's something really to look at. And again, whatever the commission is, whatever that process is, all the people in North Carolina have to be able to have access and know what's going on, and be able to participate in the process as much as possible for that to be meaningful reform in North Carolina, especially because we've got so much variety over the state. So you're going to want people from all different communities to be able to see what's going on and be able to comment in some way that has some real meaning. So just independent commission by itself, the devil's in the details of how well that would ultimately work. But I think we've got a lot of great opportunities to look at what's worked and what hasn't worked in different states and kind of pick and choose a solution that makes sense for North Carolina.
Tomas, I'm going to go to you with this. So we did actually see a number of reform bills filed in 2019, especially. And what are what were some of the good and bad aspects of the things that we saw offered as reform options for North Carolina that we need to be aware of as we go into this next long session, where I assume we will probably see some more redistricting reform again proposed?
Sorry about that. It was me. I made the mute mistake like so many of us do. In 2019, we saw a number of proposals that ranged from a full independent commission that is involved in the process, not just of drawing the maps, but approving the maps, right? Which we would say represents kind of we think the closest thing to the best model, right? Take the legislators out of it to more hybrid solutions. I think that one of the things that I want to emphasize when we think about, and I see the questions that come up in the chat, right? Like what's possible? I think the truth about what's possible is that we are looking at, in all likelihood, a fairly long road to the kind of transformative reform that I think many people are motivated to try to see, right? When we think about what we want from redistricting reform, right, not just in the lines that are in the statute or constitutional amendment, but in the outcomes, right? We talk about, we're thinking about questions about responsive government, about who exactly do we get to call constituents. And I would say, these are things that in the current political climate, are going to be hard to achieve in the short term. That doesn't mean we shouldn't push. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be articulating our vision for what we want. But we should be clear on this in this conversation that, it is likely a long road. Some things for people to look at, right? And when they're looking at redistricting reform bills, when they're hearing about it, especially this session before the actual redistricting process gets underway. And this pulls a bit from what Bob and Ayelet have talked about over the course of this conversation, right? One is transparency, right? One is, what kind of information does the public get about whoever is drawing the lines, whether it is the General Assembly, whether it is an independent commission, whether it is the staff of the General Assembly, right? Transparency. What kind of information is required to get out and when? Second is who draws the lines, right? Are there bodies that are specifically designated to draw the lines? Is there any articulation of that at all? There are proposals that sometimes say, well, formally it'll be the matter of the staff of the General Assembly to draw the lines and have this be presented, right? That's not the same thing necessarily as seeing lawmakers on the floor drawing the lines, but it is not at also the same thing as establishing an independent commission and having a selection process that is insulated from the legislative process that makes those selections. And then a third thing to watch is who approves the maps. So as Bob discussed, governor doesn't have a role here. It's just the General Assembly. But there are states that have, as Ayelet explained, hybrids. I'll add a fourth thing. And this is actually something we're talking about redistricting reform, but it's something about preservation. North Carolina is a state where the maps that we have are required to be drawn on the basis of total population. So to answer a question that came up in the chat, our Constitution sets forth the broad rules regarding redistricting. And changing the Constitution requires first a 2/3 majority of each chamber of the General Assembly to approve a ballot measure, and then for a majority of voters to approve that measure. And so it is also process-wise a big hill to climb. But this is a state where, it says maps are drawn on the basis of, the language is inhabitants. And that's important because one of the things that we've seen with the census, and now we're even seeing it in the interpretation of the census, are attempts to count, to base population counts for redistricting purposes on the basis of citizens or even voting age citizens. That takes out lots of people who I would say are constituents, who I would say are affected by the actions of government, and even at a broader level are clearly part of the communities in which they live and of our state as a whole, right? And that includes immigrants, both documented and undocumented. We really have an important thing to protect in North Carolina as well, in terms of preserving our language as to total population. And I think that we should, as we're thinking about reform, let's make sure we preserve that too.
Tomas, I think that's a really important point because people who attended the session this morning with Stacey Carlos from Census Counts, she was talking a little bit about the lawsuits around the proposed citizenship question. And the idea there was to provide the data so that kind of, redistricting on the basis of citizen voting age population could be done and thereby disenfranchise a bunch of people. And, luckily for us in North Carolina, our constitution actually mandates using the total number of inhabitants. So yeah, that's something that we have. That's actually a good thing. Some states don't have that protection. But you were talking a little bit sort of like that there are a lot of high barriers that we have to contend with when it comes to actually getting to a place where we could enact redistricting reform. Bob, I wanted to go to you and ask, from your perspective, having done this for a while, what do you think are the conditions that we would need to be in to clear some of those hurdles? What do you think would have to happen to kind of create the political will among legislators to do this?
Like, I thought we were there this summer, and unfortunately, it's really fear, not doing the right thing, but fear of being out of power that motivates the honorables, as I affectionately call them, to do the right thing. I'll remind folks that Speaker Tim Moore has sponsored redistricting reform legislation 5 times in his legislative career, and President Pro Tem Berger has done it 4 times. The only difference is, all except one exception. Well, for Berger, it was always this way. It was always when they were out of power. So we were seeing a little bit of appetite and hearing behind the scenes from the majority party folks. Maybe there would be some interest in doing something. Representative David Lewis, the defendant in our lawsuit, who is no longer in the legislature, but Tomas and Alot and you may remember, he had some kind of a little hearing that he had, it seems like a million years ago, but I think it was last year before the pandemic, to talk about criteria. And supposedly we were hoping that was going to be a process. But it really is, and I hate to say this, when I think a majority party feels like they may not be, able to maintain power, that they become a little more motivated to do something. In 2011, I will mention House Bill 824 did pass the House. Jane Penske, my colleague, and I know everybody on the call knows her. She and I were working, and it was a kind of an Iowa-style reform bill, and it was one of those brief moments when you had the Republicans who had just taken power for the first time in both chambers for the first time ever since the 19th century, and they had always been champions of reform, and many of them were still there. They were still with us on that. And the Democrats were shell-shocked, and they were going, what the hell just happened? And suddenly, overnight, they all became champions of redistricting reform. We had that bill pass 88-27 in the House. I never know exactly what the circumstances was. Was it a pass in the House and catch in the Senate? But the Senate actually never even took it up. But I don't want to give people a sense of hopelessness. I think, as Tomas and Alot had mentioned, there will be model bills filed in the legislature, and there are some things that I think we can even ask the majority party or demand that the majority party do, and that is provide more transparency to the process, replicate what we saw in the fall of 2019 when those remedial maps were drawn. It was far from perfect. It's not what transparency really should be, but we want that, and we can at least say, at a minimum, that's what we need to see, and that's where the public can see through technology, the online feed, and we, the advocates and anybody can go in the big committee room and watch the sausage making being done. The other thing is more public input on the front end and the back end. The majority party has kind of indicated that they might indeed be amenable to doing that, but I think that's a part of it as well. But in terms of true, real, comprehensive reform, I wouldn't want to mislead anybody. I don't see it happening, certainly, unfortunately, in this all-important year. And again, I do feel that it's really is when a party feels like they're out of power. The only other thing I'll say is the Constitution in North Carolina does require that legislative maps are drawn this year, the year after the census. There is no provision for congressional maps. The deadline, that deadline does not exist. So potentially, maybe if there was any kind of a swing in power in the next decade, maybe that could be addressed in a meaningful way. But anyhow, that's
so basically the answer is that we all need to be calling Stacey Abrams and asking her what we should be doing, because that's where we get that power and we create that situation. So this is sort of the last question from me, and then maybe we'll go to a couple questions of the audience before we have to wrap up. But what is the most important thing that you feel like people can do to advocate for redistricting reform in North Carolina right now? And Aylin, I'll go to you.
I think things like this, learning about it and then telling your friends about it. And we know that deep change can really take time, and it may take us years and years. So things like, holding conferences on the topic, helping educate one another on the topic, letters to the editor, guest op-eds, all those sort of general advocacy type things. And when you're, also, and this sort of underscores a little bit of what Tomas said earlier, is when we're advocating on all these different types of issues that a lot of us, will care about, is to always kind of try to come back and just tie it to some of the challenges. This is sort of like the stumbling block on the, it's on the critical path to things that a lot of people want and care about, healthcare, education, some of the environmental justice issues we've got in North Carolina. Having representatives who are really responsive to the voters is key for anything. So kind of keeping the pressure up and talking, continuing to educate one another and making sure that we don't forget about it is something that we can continue to do. And just change takes time. Sometimes it feels like forever, but it's going to continue to take time. And I think also as part of that is to look at not give up on other additional ways that we can try to help tackle the problem a little bit, like focusing on transparency in government more generally, and some things like that can help. I agree with what Bob said, that chances are not great that we will see reform passed before that's just unlikely to happen. But we can be on the lookout for I'm going to call it faux reform. Legislators know that gerrymandering is unpopular, and it would not be too hard to propose a bill that they call, something that sounds good, the, love your mom and fair maps bill. And then when you look at it, that's not what it is. So also just be on the lookout for anything like that might be fairly misleading. So that would be the other thing, is we also need to make sure that we don't accidentally agree to something that has a great title, nice, pretty bow on the top, but it's not really gonna help us.
Thanks, Aylin. Tomas, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I think the main thing I would add is total agreement that it's going to be a long game, but this year, with whatever process we have, and it's going to, pretty much going to be the one we've got, that doesn't mean that everybody who's on this call can't engage their lawmaker, right? That doesn't mean that you can't engage at a community level on ensuring that your community remains represented as a community in the way districts are drawn. And in fact, those things go toward the creation of a record that shows, hey, here's what we've said needs to be happening. And to be able to point out that difference after the fact is something that could be quite powerful.
Thanks, Tomas. Okay, so I think we do have a couple of questions. The question from Karen is, what is in the rules regarding what public feedback the legislators have to take before drawing maps? Yeah, so Ayla is giving us a visual representation. There's nothing really. There's nothing in the state constitution about that. There's nothing in state sort of jurisprudence about that. So there's no requirement. There is sort of a norm though. And maybe Bob, you can talk a little bit about what you've kind of seen in the past, and say, for example, 2011, as far as public hearings.
Yeah, we know and remember Thomas Hoffler. Someone mentioned him on the call, and we were fortunate enough to get his files. And we saw that he had drawn the maps months before they had the, to use the word the faux public hearings. That's what they do. They have their maps drawn weeks, months beforehand, have a public hearing. What we saw in 2011, they were actually using technology where they had remote public hearings, and they were all broadcast, and some of the members were in Raleigh watching people in Greenville or Asheville. Folks get a chance to say a few things. And to Tomas's point, and that's something I know Common Cause will be trying to do, and that is talking in the community about what's happening, making everybody aware around the state. It's very important that citizens participate in these public hearings and ask the right questions, to Tomas's point, to get folks on the record for what might be litigation. I mean, you hate the litigation, you hate that it has to happen. It is the only relief. Common Cause, we were never really in that game until the last few years, and that was after we knew that it's not going to happen regarding legislatively. But my hope would be, and Alette mentioned this too, transparency. Maybe the maps, I'm sure they are drawn. I'm sure both sides, Democrats have their maps as well, but maybe with a little bit of the veneer of transparency and having some public input. And as you say, like it's not really in the Constitution or not in the rules, but maybe they will agree to that. We can kind of stop some of the worst things we see, like when a historic Black university, North Carolina A&T, is split right down the middle to create two congressional districts. So anyway, we'll see what happens. I guess I'm trying to be optimistic. I will say you three on this call will be at it longer than me. I'm still at least going to be at it, and I'm not giving up. But at the same time, I think what everybody has said, we can't give up. We have to keep plugging away.
Ayla, I think you wanted to add something, and then I think we were going to start to wrap up.
One thing I wanted to say about when we talk about reform, which we may not get right away, we need to be, it is crucial that we address racially discriminatory practices very directly in whatever kind of reform we have. Even if we get a Restoration of the Voting Rights Act at the federal level, we need laws in North Carolina that can be enforced in state court that specifically, so in reform, and I think people get so uncomfortable, they don't want to talk about racism and they're tired of talking about it, but we cannot talk about this issue without talking about racially discriminatory election processes. And so I just wanted to make sure that I specifically said whatever reform, to get meaningful reform in North Carolina, we need to specifically outlaw racially discriminatory practices in elections, which includes drawing voting maps. And I hadn't said that clearly yet in this call, so I wanted to make sure I did before we got off the phone or off the Zoom.
Well, thank you, Ayla. I think that's a good point to end on. And thank you also, Tomas and Bob, for being here. And also people, I'm sure that the state NAACP and Common Cause and Democracy NC will be doing all they can to get people educated and out to participate in this redistricting process. And we at All in the Line will be as well. One thing I am going to plug that I did put in the chat, I put in the chat for a link to our legislator accountability teams, which is one thing that we're going to be doing, because I think, like we said, the legislators are in charge, and so that's one of our biggest levers. But you know, we will keep on moving towards reform. I think let us all hope that we all see it together one day, and that Bob doesn't check out the day before it gets passed. All right, so we're going to close out this session, and thank you to everyone for attending. Our next session I'm really excited about. It is Peter Miller from the Brennan Center talking about how to make an effective public comment. So participating in the process is important, and making that participation as effective as possible is doubly important. So I hope you will all attend that. So what we will be doing is we will be ending this webinar, we'll close it, but you will be using the exact same link to get into Peter's session. And what you may see is you may see a little screen that says, you know, we are waiting to be let in. And that just means we're going to get together with Peter a few minutes beforehand, make sure his PowerPoint is set up and he sounds good and all that stuff. So you will be let in right when the session starts at 1 p.m. All right, well, thank you again to Ayla, to Bob, to Tomas. This was a fantastic conversation, and we will hopefully be seeing you all again soon, and see everyone else in a few minutes at the next session.